Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Afterlife podcast. This is your host, Pooja Chilakuri. Today, I am honored to be in conversation with Julie Cluff. Julie is a grief specialist. She's a speaker, an intuitive angel guide. She's also an author of the book, Miracles in the Darkness. She is also the host of two podcasts, Light the Day and Build a Life After Loss. After healing from the sudden death of her two young children on Mother's Day 2007, Julie experienced a powerful shift in her spiritual gifts and understanding. She learned to communicate across the veil and began channeling messages from the angelic realm. Julie uses these gifts to help those that she works with to help them connect to their inner wisdom and their spirit team. Thank you so much for joining me today, Julie. It's such a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, all the pleasure is all mine, I assure you.
I'm so glad that we have met through this organization, the International Association for Near-Death Studies, at the conference. And your story and your book, because I did read your book, resonates very deeply with me, Julie. And I know it's going to bring inspiration to many, many people. So without wasting any more time, I would love for you to share your journey. I know you've had multiple experiences with grief and how everything led to you becoming a grief specialist.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so my life has been kind of dotted by grief and loss, and I think I'm not unusual. I think everybody's life has been impacted in a great way by grief, and some of the grief that people experience they don't even recognize. But some of the big things that happened for me was I went through the death of my brother to suicide when he was in his 20s. I was in my 20s also. So my youngest brother. And then just a couple years after that, my first marriage ended in divorce, and I had three young children. But then I remarried. I had three children with my first husband. I have three children with my second husband, and we raised those six kids together because for various reasons, he became their dad, and we did just one big family. And on Mother's Day in 2007, I was traveling with my three youngest children, who were 12, 10, and 8 at the time. We were traveling across country. We lived in Texas at the time. We were driving to North Carolina. And in the middle of the afternoon on that Mother's Day, I fell asleep at the wheel, having never felt tired. And when I fell asleep at the wheel, I woke up just shocked in the driving along in the median between the eastbound and westbound lanes. I was right at the border of Mississippi and Alabama. And when I woke up and realized I was not on the road, I immediately tried to bring my vehicle back up on the road. And when I turned the wheel of the SUV, I just it, you could just I just felt the wheels lift off the ground, and we just started rolling. And we rolled across two lanes of highway into the grass on the other side of the highway. It was quite a impactful accident, as you can just imagine. When we landed, I could not see anything. My eyesight was impaired. I everything was dark, but I my whole system was in shock. I could hear my 12-year-old son, who was in the passenger seat next to me, I could hear him. So I knew that he was, I'm just going to say it, I knew he was alive. I also felt like he was hurt because I heard him crying, but I was just glad to hear him. But when I started calling out for Carrie and David, there was no answer. And as my eyesight returned, I looked around and I could just, I mean, that picture of what that looks like is so clear in my mind. Just all the destruction, all the broken glass, it was, it's hard to even explain. And then as I was frantically looking for my daughter Carrie, who was 10, and my son David, who was 8 at the time that this happened, I turning around because they were had been in the back seat, and I looked at, I couldn't find them. And then as I was scanning, I noticed them off in what it felt like half a football field away. They had been thrown from the car. And at that point, frankly, I just started screaming, I killed my kids, I killed my kids, which is heartbreaking for me because my 12-year-old son experienced that too, you know. But I really was just, I was frantic. But as I sat there, I thought, I knew in that moment that either they were both here or they were both gone. I just could not imagine one of them leaving without the other. They were either both here or they were both gone. And I just, I knew that instinctively. And as I, like I said, they had been thrown from the car, um, and two ambulances showed up. An ambulance took Carrie and David to one hospital. Another ambulance took James and I, my 12-year-old son, and I to a different hospital. And so I laid on a striker board, frantic for information from anybody that could tell me how Carrie and David were. No one would give me any updates. They would just say, you know, we're waiting for information. We're waiting for information. And eventually, my aunt and uncle arrived at the hospital. And when they arrived, they put my husband on the phone, who was rushing to get a flight out of Houston to where we were in Mississippi. And he told me that Carrie and David didn't make it. And it was, you know, the the moment my eyesight returned and I just saw everything, my mind did this crazy thing where it's like, how can I turn back time? How can I turn back time? How can I just wanted 5 minutes to go back in time. I just wanted everything to not be what it was in that moment, because up until that moment, life felt pretty perfect. It felt pretty perfect. And when I sat there in that car with all that destruction around me and realizing I had fallen asleep at the wheel, I just couldn't imagine what was happening to our world. It was completely overwhelming. But there were a few things that happened during that time. So even, I mean, this was devastating. It was heartbreaking, but there were some points even during the accident where I was brought to kind of a different awareness. So even in the middle of rolling, in the middle of the vehicle rolling, I heard a voice that said, "Bring in your arm." And that voice was calm, it was peaceful, and somehow I had the presence of mind to actually do it. And it wasn't long after that that I met someone who had lost their arm in a rollover accident. I'd heard of somebody else who had lost their arm in a rollover accident. So it was like the angels were helping me to, they knew that, I mean, it was just, in hindsight, like in that moment, I couldn't make sense of all these things that happened. But in hindsight, I see how my arm was protected, that, which makes no sense because there's all these miracles, but why not the miracle of my kids being okay? And that's what I had to grapple with, because there were all these miracles that happened. We got to the hospital, and it was Mother's Day. It was a holiday. It was Sunday, and everybody was like, um, what is Dr. Rush doing here? The hospital was named after his family. He actually had discovered or developed the procedure, I should say, that my son needed to, because he had surgery on his leg after the accident, and he was there at the hospital. And so everybody was like, what is he doing here? He shouldn't be here. It's Mother's Day, it's a holiday, it's Sunday. And I know why he's there. I know that he was there for my son, and he became very much an earth angel for our family in so many ways, so good to us. But there were so many things that happened that over time, when I was able to integrate everything that happened, helped me to understand at a higher level what really happened that day. Um, I I feel today that I understood at the time kind of this, the idea of a life plan to a certain extent, but it really, I really understood it later when I realized that Carrie and David were, it was their time. And I just truly believe that we we think we have so much control, but we don't. And there's this life plan, and their plan was to be here 8 and 10 years. And I had a choice. I could be their mom for 8 and 10 years, or I could not be their mom. And so I choose every day. I am so grateful every day that I was their mom here for 8 and 10 years. Of course, I'm always their mom. I want to make that clear too. Yeah.
Wow. Julie, I am listening to you, and the first thing I just want to appreciate you and thank you for sharing your story, because I know it's like every time we share, we kind of also relive a little piece of that. And I appreciate you for having the courage to do that, just looking at you, right? Whether it was at the conference or whether speaking to you last week at your podcast, every interaction I have with you, right? I just see this person radiating and glowing with life and joy. And I would never guess that, deep within you would be this story, this
Yeah.
kind of a story, because I know you said that grief is common to everyone, but I also think that what you experienced is not that common. In fact, I don't know if it's trauma, it's grief, and I'm also very sure that added to that there was some guilt.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. And just to be clear, like I suffered from PTSD. I was in chronic grief, chronic pain, not physical pain, because my physical injuries were very minor, but emotional pain for 3 years. I was doing so poorly that 3 years after the accident, my husband had a business trip and he took me with him because he was afraid to leave me at home. But then I had this, much like you did, I had this miraculous healing where I received a special prayer, and I literally within 24 hours, all that darkness had lifted, because the darkness had become so all consuming that it became physical, like it was tangible. It was just like my whole being was just filled with darkness. But I do remember, I have very distinct memories of sitting on in my backyard, and this couldn't have been more than 2 weeks after the accident. And I remember sitting in my backyard, and I remember thinking, after my brother died, after the divorce, after these other things had happened, and there's always more, right? But after these other things that happened, somehow I figured out how to go on with life, how to be happy again. And in my mind, I thought, maybe there's a possibility that I could be happy again. But one of the things, and I just want to share this because I just feel like, for whatever reason, this might be important to share. One of the things that really caused me a lot of pain, I was aware of grief. I because I'd had these other experiences, which actually really helped me in many ways. Um, this was so different than my previous grief experiences, but I was familiar. And so I had this hope that maybe there's a way through. And so I really allowed myself to grieve. I really allowed myself to be in pain. I allowed myself to be in that space. But early on, I had a therapist say to me, we choose to be happy. unfortunately, the message came at the wrong time. I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think there is truth to that. But in that moment, when he said that, I was not prepared for that message. And especially coming from a professional.
Mhm.
So, about a year and a half into my grief, I've been allowing it, I've been patient with it. But we get to this messy middle where we start to re engage with life, but we know that we're not all there. And there's this um it's kind of this half awake, half asleep state, and we just want to be awake, like we want to be all in, but we don't know how to get there. And that's when I started beating myself up. And I but there was so much guilt too. I mean, it was so complex. I was dealing with very complicated grief. I'm dealing with PTSD. It was difficult. I didn't drive a car for several weeks after the accident, and then even after that, it was really challenging to drive a car. I'm happy to say that I'm able to drive now. I don't deal with PTSD anymore. I received very good care, um, and I was engaged in my healing, even though I didn't know what to do, even though I was always in the search. I was always feeling like there there there's a path. I just always felt like there was a path. Always felt like there was hope, but I got to the point where I just could not manage it anymore. And that's when I had this miraculous healing, and the lights came on, and it was just unbelievable. You know, there were so many things that happened, and you read the book, so you're aware, but there were so many things that happened before the accident, during the accident, even after the accident. And I realize now that everything that I needed to heal was available to me in the moment
Mhm.
of the accident. But it takes time to integrate all that. It takes time to understand all that. It takes time and energy and effort, and by God's grace and all of that, right? It just takes it. Grief is work. It is work. And a lot of times we, you know, as a society, we say time heals all wounds, but like I don't remember who said this, but to give them credit. But somebody said, you know, if it was time that healed all wounds, we would all be walking around healed, because we all have time between our experiences and where we are right now. But it's not the time. It really is about the effort and finding the tools and the time. Like it's all of it, right? You know, we can't rush it, but we can't just sit and expect healing to just show up. I had an experience that this was what I wanted to share is six, I guess it would have been October. So the accident happened in May, and in October. So about 5 months after the accident, I walked in to a drugstore, and there was a costume hanging there because they'd put out the Halloween costumes. And my first thought was, Carrie would love that. This is my 10-year-old daughter who passed away. And I just, that was my first go-to, was she would love that costume. And of course, split second later, it's like, she's not here. She's not going to be here for Halloween. And the devastation just hit again. It seems odd. It may seem odd that I even had that thought, you know, she would love that, because obviously I've already been living with 5 months of them not being here. But it's that minute to minute, day to day shock that this is the new reality. And when I had that thought, she's not here, in my mind, I said, why did this have to happen? And I heard in my mind, they're right where they're supposed to be. And then my inner voice, my in my own mind, I said, but why did it have to happen this way? Because how devastating to be the mom who's in a rollover accident and two children died. Like it's devastating. It's absolutely devastating. And so I asked the question, but why did it have to happen this way? And I heard that spirit voice in my head again say, how would you have liked it to happen? And there's no better answer to that question, because when that question was asked, of course, my mind went searching. And so there's a couple of things like implicit in that question. First of all, Spirit had already told me they're right where they're supposed to be. But second of all, then the question is, how would you have liked it to happen? So in other words, it was going to happen. How would you have liked it to happen? What would have been a better scenario? And I realized, while what happened wasn't ideal, obviously, I mean, that's a given, there really is no good answer to that. And so I had to come to terms with, this was what was in the life plan. It was in my life plan, it was in their life plan, it was in my family's life plan. At one point when I was couple years down the line, I remember just saying, God, why here's my two boys who were, so I had my two oldest daughters were at college at this point, and I have a 15-year-old son and a 12-year-old son, and this horrible thing has happened to our family. And so my 15-year-old, my 12-year-old, by this time they're like 17 and 14. I'm like, they're teenagers. I'm like, what? And I'm checked out. I'm like, I can't, I'm totally not capable of being a good mom. It wasn't that I just let them do whatever, but it's different. Like, you're checked out, you're not emotionally available, you're not paying attention. It's all the things. And I remember just, again, God, why why is this happening? Why this isn't fair to my boys? And I heard in that moment, this was part of their plan too. And again, I couldn't deny these impressions I received, because these certainly weren't thoughts from my head. These were not thoughts I would have come up with. So I was used to receiving answers like that, but I wasn't used to the idea of communicating with those that have passed. I was used to the idea that, if we spoke to God, that He could communicate with us, that He could share with us. And since then, I've learned so much about angels and angelic help, and how we are never left alone. We are always, there's always help for us. And I know even in my darkest days, there were angels surrounding me. Not only angels as we think of angels, but my kids were there. My brother who had passed was there. They're still here. They're still here helping our family. And over time, I learned to communicate with them, communicate with my brother, and then a lot of other unusual things began to happen.
Yes, that was actually going to be one of my questions for you, Julie, because I know you are an intuitive and you have the gift of, channeling angels. So, at what point in that grief journey did you experience that shift? Was it after you felt healed of that initial, that those raw emotions that I know that comes with the first few stages of grief, anyways?
For sure. At that 3-year mark where I received that healing, that blessing of healing, and I had I have a I have a very strong religious tradition, and so a lot of the experiences that I had, I was translating them from my religious training, and a lot of that was extremely helpful to me. I'm grateful for the spiritual training that I received in that tradition. That was a true blessing for me. But there were other things that were happening that just could not be explained within the religious tradition, within the religious definition. And so I had to kind of, search my soul, pray, ask for answers. One of the things that happened, I recently found my journal from 2010. So the accident happened in 2007. At the beginning of 2010, I was like I said, I was really doing poorly, and my therapist had asked me to do a little bit of writing, which I didn't do much. But what's in there is, it is telling of what I was experiencing at the time. What's interesting about this journal is that I had written in it early in May, a little bit in April. I'm just talking like 3 or 4 pages. Like I didn't do much. I just did the bare minimum that she asked me to do. And then there's a couple of blank pages. And then in June, I started writing. And I started writing consistently since June of 2010. And I would write down impressions. I would write down inspiration. I would ask. It developed into this pattern of I each morning I would get up and I'd say, what do I want to learn more about today? And I would say, like love. And I would, go to my Bible and I would look at verses about love and I would write down the inspiration. And as I was studying, I'd be like, oh, I want to learn more about hope, or I want to learn more about this, and I would write that subject at the beginning of the next page. And so the next day I would come in and I would study that. And so that became my pattern. And then over time, it became a pattern for me to just ask questions and just ask, what do I do about this? And I would just write the inspiration as it came. Whatever came into my mind, I would write it down. And then that turned into, what do I need to know today? So I wasn't even asking the question, like specific questions. I still was doing that. But a lot of my journaling over the last 2 or 3 years was, what do I need to know today? And I would just write what I received. And that turned into being able to communicate with angels, understand those messages, receive that inspiration. But it just opened up into this space where I realized I could also receive those messages for other people. I share angel messages on my Instagram account. And that just opened up a whole nother world. And I don't even know if I even came close to answering your question. I don't know that I did.
No, I think you did, Julie. This gift, I guess I was trying to understand if it was just this one moment in time or it was gradual and you answered it, you know?
Well, it felt like it was one moment in time. It really, truly did. But then I was like, well, wait a second. I've been doing all this. And then to find that journal from 2010
Yeah.
and see that stark difference between these couple of just painful, dark entries here, and then see the lights turn on and see that transition was remarkable. One of the things that happened, and this, so okay, I'm gonna go back to 2012. So 2007, the accident. 2010, I received this healing. 2012, I met this man. We were at this lunch. I'd never met him before. He was sharing his story. My mom turned to me and said, "Share your story." And I just went white. I was like, because I wasn't used to sharing my story at that point. And but I did, haltingly. I shared a little bit about what happened. And he was so kind. And as we left the restaurant, he grabbed me by the arm and he said, "You're supposed to do something with this."
Oh.
And it was like lightning hit my body. It was like God stood in front of me himself and said, "You're supposed to do something with this." But I didn't know what that was. But that never left me. It was like, as I say that to you, I'm like standing in that restaurant right now, re-experiencing that moment. So I had that experience. And then through a cycle and different things, I ended up coaching and then developed a grief coaching program. And then a couple of years into doing that work, this was really unusual. So I'm kind of a math person. I like numbers. And I started seeing 12s everywhere. And I thought, this cannot just be coincidence. I mean, what is this all about? What are these? And 12s is the actually the date of my birthday, the day of my birthday. And my birthday was the weekend that the kids died too. So it was just a un, really hugely unusual situation. But I started seeing 12s everywhere and they just stood out, and I was like, what does this mean? So in my search of what this meant, and then I started to understand, like, this idea of angel numbers and how angels can bring us messages through numbers. And I'll be quite honest with you, I am a bit of a skeptic. I mean, I would have friends that would talk about how they were receiving these messages from their relatives that were on the other side, or they were receiving these, and I'd be like, okay, I mean, it's not that I didn't believe them, but I was just like, yeah, I think maybe you're stretching that a little bit. But then it was happening to me, and I just couldn't deny it anymore. And that just took me on a whole journey of learning about angels and what all this meant. And I got really, really connected to understanding how powerful our angels are, how beautiful they are, how much they love us. They're not judging us. So I came from a background where I felt like if you know if God was watching me, he was judging me, right? That was the kind of the background I came from. And so I thought, if there's any angelic presence around me, they're judging me. And if I do anything wrong, they're going to leave, right? The spirit leaves if I'm not totally connected. But I can tell you in that moment that I received that spiritual healing and that emotional healing, there was nothing angelic about me. There was nothing deserving in me, right? I received that, like, and that was one of the beautiful things too, is as a friend of mine, in this one of these very dark days I was having, I said, I feel like God is punishing me. And she said, God only blesses us. And it opened my eyes to, like, oh, is that a possibility? Could that be? But I started learning about angels. I'm kind of all over the place. I apologize, but
Share everything, Julie. I am intrigued by your story, so please go for it.
well, seeing these 12s, and then I started, as I was studying more, and I started to recognize more and more communication. And then I started to realize that, maybe that voice in my head is the angels speaking to me. Maybe these inspired messages that I'm receiving every day as I journal and say, what do I need to know today? Maybe these are the angels speaking to me. I started to understand that, and I started to realize that, because I was used to the stories about how, these miraculous things happen. There's a fire, and somebody shows up and takes the person out, and they disappear, and that was kind of the angel story that I was used to. The angels showed up when bad things happened, and that's when they showed up. But I started to understand that the angels are with us all the time, and they're trying to help us all the time, and they understand the struggles that we're in. So they're not judging us. We're like the toddler that's learning how to walk, and we don't judge the toddler that's learning how to walk. They're not judging us. They're encouraging us. They're moving us forward. They know our life plan better than we know our life plan, and they're just trying to guide us and help us if we'll listen. And I started to understand this at such a deep level that they could help me, right. I mean, I wrote my book, and when I got done writing it and I reread it, I thought, I didn't write that. I'm sure you can appreciate that. Like, I read it and I was like, where did that come from? I just wrote a foreword for someone's book that they wrote about grief. And I got the book and I was rereading what I wrote. I'm like, I didn't write that. Like, I'm not that smart. I'm not smart enough to have written all that. So I just saw how they were helping all along the way. And then almost 2 years ago, I was on a trip, and I had learned to call on my angels just for help and day-to-day stuff and the things that I was doing. And that can be done, when you pray to God. They're angels, they're messengers from God, right? So I I was on a trip. We had gone out whale watching, and by the time we got out on this boat, which ended up not being much of a boat, I was pretty grumpy. It was mid-afternoon. We were on this boat that was really uncomfortable. It was not what I was expecting. We were out there, in off of the coast of Mexico, and we weren't seeing anything. And this was my first time whale watching. I thought, oh, this is going to be a dud. And these were my thoughts. And all of a sudden I heard, Julie, you have angels. And my whole being lit up. And I was like, oh, I have angels. So in my head, I started saying, thank you, angels, for bringing the whales close to our boat. Thank you for bringing our boat close to the whales. And within 10 minutes, we were surrounded by whales and dolphins. I cannot even tell you the show that we saw. There were at least seven whales, seven, eight whales around us. There were 15 dolphins at least, like swimming along. They were playing in the water. I mean, it was a spectacular show on all sides of us. And even our guide was like, you guys have good energy. You guys have, like, he was like, wow, like, because we had seen virtually nothing up until that point, and we were like halfway through, more than halfway through our trip. All of a sudden we just have this spectacular show. And then our guide says, it's time, we've got to get back to shore. And then the whales started to swim off, and this one whale, you know how they'll put their tail up out of the water and slap the water. So this last whale came up out of the water, just his tail, and just slapped the water over and over and over again, like he was waving goodbye. And then I didn't take any pictures, I didn't take any video, because I was just enthralled. I was just in bliss. It's one of the most blissful memories of my life. And, since then, my daughter has communicated to me, I was there. My son has communicated to me, I was there too. Don't forget about me. He always comes in and says, don't forget about me. I was there too. Um, and the next day I heard a message to start teaching about angels.
Mm.
So I came home from that trip and planned a webinar and did a class on angels. And I've taught several since then. And it's just a joy to just bring this to everyone. And one of the biggest misconceptions, because every time I do a class on angels, somebody will say, well, aren't you worried about, connecting to the dark side, or, and, and, and I just say, no, it's our fear that we're going to connect to the wrong source that keeps us from connecting more clearly to the light that we really want. We can tell the difference. Like, when you're with somebody who's mean and ornery, you can tell the difference between that and someone who's kind and loving. It's the same. Your intentions of connecting with that divine light brings the divine light to you. There's nothing. I'm going to go out on a big limb here and just say there's nothing to fear. And honestly, I will say, when I was a kid, and even as a young adult, I mean, I had this fear for years. I was afraid to pray for so many years because I was afraid that I would attract dark entities,
Mhm.
dark spirits.
Mhm.
And I look at that and I went, that is so backwards. We just really need to stop giving so much power to the negative and bring our energy into the good and the positive and the light.
Mhm.
Um, anyway.
No, you answered a question that popped in my head. It's like you read my mind, because I was totally gonna go there and ask you, what about dark entities? And because you know how many people I talk to that, because of this fear, right? It even keeps them from exploring any kind of spirit, anything.
Right, right.
And
And I've seen that everywhere. I
mhm,
see that everywhere when I, most people are very, very open, but a lot of people, like I said, every time I
Yeah.
teach it. Somebody asks about that.
Yeah.
And I know if one person's asking, or two people, or five people, there's probably five times that or 10 times that asking the same question. So,
And I think we just don't realize how powerful we are. And I don't see that in any kind of, egotistical way. The power of God, the power of love, all those things are within us. And you said something very important, Julie, that it matches our intention. When
mhm.
we are truly desiring to connect with the divine, I don't think there's actually a verse in the Bible where Jesus said, if your son asks you for bread, you're not going to give them stone. And if they ask you for fish, you're not going to give them a snake, right?
Yeah,
So you just reminded me of that when we are asking with such pure, clear hearts, then hopefully, I believe we will be met with pure, clear energy.
yeah. Ask and receive.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. That's so beautiful,
and
Julie.
find.
Your story has so many pieces to it because you had support from the angelic realm, and yet you had to do all this work. So I just feel like we are such, complex as humans, mind, body, spirit, everything, right? So we can't say, oh, we're going to use all our tools are going to be spiritual or all our tools are going to be physical. I really feel we need to somewhere learn how to blend them. And you've done that, which is what I find very unique about, your journey. And I've always also thought that this world is hard. And I've always said to myself, there was a time in my life I wanted to be an atheist. I was
Mhm.
having a hard time with religion, but I quickly came back to something because I was like, I don't think I can do this alone.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
And so I appreciate, and it's amazing that you do use all these tools in your work with people. But I do have a question about grief. I came back to that because I feel like it's such an important topic. People grieve for different reasons, different things. Yours was layered with trauma, guilt, so much that you had to go through, Julie. But I know, grief is not something very comfortable. And I feel like I'm not sure if as a society we're even prepared to make space for people when they're grieving because as I was telling you earlier, growing up, if we got sick, we took our time. We had 3 or 4 days, we would shut down, heal, before we went back to school. When I came here, it was like pop a Tylenol and get back to work the next day, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes I feel like we're doing that with grief. We're not being patient. We're like, move on, get over it. You got this to do and that to do. What is your experience about that?
You're absolutely right. And one of the things, it's interesting that you bring up the, getting sick, because I use physical a lot of times as a reference point. Because if you break your leg, you're not going to go run a marathon the next day. There's a reason for the pain. The pain in your leg is a clue that you need to rest, that you need to give it attention, that you need to do some things to put it in place to heal. You're not going to go out and run a marathon the next day. It's just not going to happen. So we need to look at our emotional injuries the same way. And grief is, loss is an emotional injury. So if we look at it as an emotional injury, then we've got to do the same things. We've got to take the time. We've got to seek some assistance. We've got to find out what tools we can use, because just like with a broken leg, it might need to be casted. Just like with our grief, we might need to learn some new tools or bring on some new things to help us in that situation. um, our capacity is lowered when we're in grief. So to think that we can just go back and do what we were doing before is, it just doesn't make any sense. So what ends up happening, a lot of times I use the analogy of moving. I've moved in the last few years, and there's a point at which you like unload your boxes and you get to the point where you're comfortable because you've got like forks in the drawer and you've got plates in the cabinet, but there's still like 5 boxes sitting in the bedroom that haven't been unloaded because you don't need that stuff right away. That's kind of like what happens with our grief. Like we work through the beginning stages of it, but we get in the messy middle and we hear one of two messages. One is you're never going to get over it. Like you're always going to grieve. I hear that message all the time. People say that to me all the time. I'm sure you'll grieve forever. And I just don't. I don't think I think there's a vocabulary issue, first of all, because when I think of grief, I think of that unrelenting pain that's just there and there and there and always there. What I experienced after the grief moved on, what I experienced was occasional sadness, like the anniversary of the accident. And I don't even experience that anymore, frankly, but because I'm just so connected to my kids. And of course, I would want them here. It would be lovely to have had that physical experience with them here, but that wasn't our our thing. It's like saying, your kid goes off to college and they've got to move back home with you. And I know it's not the same, and I'm not trying to say it's the same, but so that we either get the message that we're going to grieve forever, and especially parents who lose children receive that message over and over and over again. So they start to believe that they're going to grieve forever. So they don't even look for healing. They don't even look for healing of that emotional injury because they've been told they'll grieve forever. Or the second message they get is just get over it. And so they get the message either through words or just through people's actions or attitudes toward them that they need to just move on. So what happens in those two instances is then the pain is hidden. It goes inside. They carry that pain inside. They can't express it because it's not acceptable to express it. And they, if they believe that they're going to have to carry it, then they've got to carry it. They've got to figure out how to just carry it. So then it just becomes this darkness inside them that they're carrying on their own with no outside support. And what I really want to suggest is that is a really hard place to be. I was working with a client one time and she said, and I was like, oh my gosh, that is so true. She said, I used to believe that everybody had pain and everyone was just walking around with pain. And that's just the way it was. And there was nothing we could do about it. Because she was realizing, oh, there is a path forward. There is a way to move through this. We do a lot of things that connect us to our grief and cause us to feel like we can't let go of the grief. And a couple of things that we do is we tie love to grief. So we say, because I love that person, I grieve. So now we can't let go of the grief because then we're saying we don't love the person, but those are two separate things. I am able to fully experience that overwhelming joy and love for my kids now more than I ever was during my grief because I've let go of the pain. The love is able to flourish. And then if somebody has been injured, so if somebody has been the victim of a crime or a victim of abuse or any other thing like that's a negative loss, they're all negative, you know what I'm saying?
I do.
It's a different type of loss. Then they think they have to hold on to the pain in order for the other person to be held accountable. And that is also not helpful. We don't have to hold on to the pain in order for the other person to be accountable. They're accountable. We're accountable to ourselves. We're responsible for ourselves. We have the ability to respond in our own life. And so we have the opportunity to do those things that we need in those cases where we've been victimized or where we've had an abuse situation, we have the ability to respond to that by getting the assistance we need to heal and allow the other person to carry the guilt and the shame or the responsibility for what was done.
Wow. You've been like reading my mind today, because one of the questions I also had was, what are some of the common misconceptions? And it just made me pause when you said that we tie love and grief. I definitely had that. That was my mindset until this moment,
Yeah,
until you said it. And it made me pause, Julie, because I
that
am
gets
one of those
repeated.
people.
Yeah, it gets repeated over and over and over
Yeah,
again.
yeah.
And
It
just
feels
because
inside.
something is repeated doesn't mean it's true.
That's so true. That is so true. Oh my goodness, Julie. I could talk to you forever. I do have one more question
Okay.
about grief. And I find it difficult when somebody's grieving, and especially if they're close to me and I'm very much invested in that situation. I find it difficult to hold back my emotions, to not cry. When I'm trying to support them, I cannot be the one crying. What are some things we could do to better support people that are grieving in our lives?
Well, I'd like to answer that question with a question. What if it's okay to cry with them?
Is it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I can remember, it's interesting. This memory just popped into my head. I can remember after my divorce, and my daughter was 8 years old, and she had a special event coming up. And she and her dad, I knew he wasn't going to, I knew he wasn't going to be there for it, but he had kind of made promises that he would, but I knew that the circumstances were that he wasn't going to be there, and he wasn't going to be there for her, and so I remember sitting in the living room with her and just sharing with her, he's not going to be able to make it back, and it's okay. You can still have a good event. This can still be a special thing for you. And she started to cry, and I cried with her.
Um,
And it's one of the most precious memories I have of just allowing myself to just cry with her and just experiencing that pain with her. Because in many ways, when you're expressing your sorrow and your hurt and your pain, you're acknowledging their pain, and you're grieving with them.
mhm.
Yeah.
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 And
And just to add to that, because it's not always that we will cry with somebody, but it's okay if we do. But the most important thing we can do is just allow them to be exactly where they are, because we want to fix things because they're in pain, and we don't want to see people in pain because that's painful for us. And just allowing people to be right where they are is the best gift that we can give them.
thank you, Julie. Thank you very much. This is probably like the first time I've had on-air counseling. Oh, thank you. Thank you. The work you do, I think it's really special, sacred, I even want to say, and I will make sure that I have all of your links in the show notes. The best way to reach you is through your website and Instagram. And I downloaded the free ebook on angels that you have on your website. So thank you. I
You're
think you have
welcome.
a couple of podcasts. So yeah, I'll be sharing all of the
Yeah.
things. And I love your Instagram posts, so please keep them coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I
I mean,
appreciate
it's been such a joy to have this conversation with you, Julie. Is there any other things, last things that you would like to share with us? Oh, I wanted to read a quote from your book that really blessed me. I don't want to forget to do that. I have written, I'm glad you had made space here for notes. And I think there was just one sentence, one little phrase, and it just made me pause. And all it says is, I was showing up and figuring it out. That's all
uh,
it says. And I'm already 60 pages into this book, and I've already invested in your emotions and everything you're going through. And then, sometimes the simplest thing like showing up can be so difficult. Just for you to show up and figure it out, it took all this work.
Mm,
And so I really appreciate you for being so invested in your own healing,
yeah.
And there was also something else in this book that actually made me think, when you're in that messy middle where you might have good days, right? You might actually be able to let go of the pain and those memories for some time and experience some normalcy, right? But even in that, there is a struggle. When I'm reading this part, it says, if I showed up an emotional mess, people would think I was falling apart. And sometimes, if you acted like everything was okay, then I would appear to have not loved my kids. Again, the tying the love and the grief. So
Mhm.
thank you for writing this book, and you've outlined everything. It's very raw. It's very true. It spoke to me. So thank you. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the challenge is, and as I work with clients, a lot of times that's I hear it from everybody. It's like, I don't even know how to show up in my life because you're carrying so much, and it's so raw, and um, it's so unimaginable for somebody else. One of the things that I shared in the book, it's like, if it's like an earthquake, you're at the epicenter of the earthquake because the loss occurred to you. But all the people outside of that, friends and family, depending on how much they were in the epicenter, they're your friends are still getting up every day and going to work and going to the store and buying milk, and they're not sitting in the rubble. So nobody is going to experience it the way that you experience it. And so putting pressure on yourself to be okay because the people around you are okay or think you should be okay is not valid, because you are still picking up the pieces and they don't understand what you're living with. Um, but I I would just love to just I feel like I what I want to share is just this idea that even when we aren't aware. So if you're going through grief right now, that heaviness, that weight will disconnect you from the love that you might normally feel from that divine love that you might normally feel, right? And that the angelic presence, or it separates you from that because you're on a different frequency. So just keep in mind that when you're experiencing challenging things, you're not going to be on the same frequency as the angels or your guides, and so you're going to feel cut off. But if mentally you can remember, I might feel cut off, but I'm not.
Mhm.
I have seen it where I was working with a client one day, and um, she had lost a son to suicide. And I actually connected with her grief angels. There's specialty angels that come in at different times of our life to help us. And these grief angels were there. They were there with her, but she couldn't feel it. And I even remember one day my therapist, who was spiritually connected also, and she said to me one day, she said, there's a lot of help here for you, like just kind of referring to, like, in the room. And she's like, can you feel that? I couldn't connect to it at all, and that's okay. So know that the angels are there. They're always here helping us. If you have something that you want to do that sounds fun, ask them to help you. If you have a challenge that you're trying to overcome, ask them to help you. Like, have that dialogue, write down your, the things that you would love some support with. I remember, gosh, it's been probably a year ago. I one day I was, because this last couple of years have been really eye-opening for me, because not only have I over the years learned to connect with my own kids, but I've started to connect with other people's on the other side. And in 2020, I actually was getting in my car, and a friend's son had just passed away 2 weeks before. And I felt him in the car with me. And I was like, what am I supposed to do with this? Like, it was the first time I had kind of experienced that. So I just got out my phone and started making notes, and then sent that to her. But more recently, I've been experiencing more and more of that. And about a year ago, I was like, everything was changing so much, and it was a little overwhelming for me, because all these spiritual gifts I really feel like opened up with this accident, and then they've just been coming in over this time period. And I remember asking my angels, I said, if I'm on the right track, send me 3 17s. I'm like, this is really unusual. So, I know this is going to be easy. And I just forgot about it. I wrote that down in my journal. I just thought that I wrote it down, and I just wanted some confirmation I was on the right track. And I thought, okay, maybe over the next 2 or 3 days, I'll see 3 17s. A couple of days later, I was on the highway, and all of a sudden I had this thought, oh, I forgot. I literally had forgotten. And all of a sudden I thought, oh, I forgot. I asked for 3 17s. I guarantee you, as my angels saying, don't forget you asked for 3 17s, because in that moment I looked up, and on the GPS, we had 17 miles, 17 minutes. And then I looked to the right, and the license plate next to me had 17 right there. And then, not, they were like, that's not all. I needed to send a message to somebody on my phone. Like, this was in 30 seconds. I needed to send a message to someone on my phone, and I wrote something about a schedule, and the calendar emoji came up. I had no idea the calendar emoji has 17 on it. And there were two that showed up on my phone. So within, I would say, probably 15 seconds, there were 5 17s right there. So anyway, just a fun story to end with.
I think sometimes they have fun with us too.
Oh, they have so much fun with us.
Yeah. We can take things so seriously sometimes, but
Yeah,
it's nice to have some fun. Yeah.
it is nice to have some fun.
Julie, it's been incredible. Thank you, thank you, and thank you. And thank you for teaching us so many things today. Love, love, love your energy. Love that we've connected. And I would love to stay in touch. What is the best way, if people that are listening and watching, if they wanted to connect with you, is the best place to go is your Instagram? I'll have every link, but what would you prefer?
So I have a website, juliecluff.com. It's under construction right now, so I will just, warn you, but you may be listening to this 2 years from now and it may look beautiful. It's getting there. It's getting there. But yeah, juliecluff.com. And that will give you links to the new podcast, which is Light the Day, which actually hasn't launched yet, which will launch in a couple of weeks. And it also give you links to the website Build a Life After Loss, where I have all the grief um, resources and 170 something plus podcast episodes on grief. So that's a great place to go. Instagram, Julie Cluff Coaching. You can email me at julie@juliecluff.com, all the things. So
Thank you so much to those that are watching and listening. I hope that Julie's story and everything, all her expertise that she has shared with us today, I hope that it's been inspiring. I know that it has for me. So thank you once again, Julie.
thank you.